The lake had always been a place of peace. Its glassy surface reflected the skies of every season, soft pink at sunrise, deep cobalt at night, and a warm shimmer of gold on those quiet summer afternoons when the air itself seemed to nap. Weeks that followed were filled with paperwork instead of fishing rods, signatures instead of casts, and negotiations instead of quiet mornings by the dock. At first, the process seemed overwhelming, like staring at a mountain too steep to climb. The morning the notices went out was as calm as any other. The lake stretched under the soft haze of dawn. Birds skimmed the surface for insects. The lake had always been a place of peace. Its glassy surface reflected the skies of every season, soft pink at sunrise, deep cobalt at night, and a warm shimmer of gold on those quiet summer afternoons when the air itself seemed to nap. For years, it had been the retreat of one man who considered himself lucky to own a modest cabin tucked against its shoreline. That man had seen his share of city stress, long commutes, and corporate grind, but when he settled by the lake, life slowed into a rhythm of simple joys. Mornings meant coffee on the dock, afternoons brought fishing with nothing but a line, a bucket, and patience, and evenings closed with the distant call of loons across the water. But on a day that began like all the others, tranquility ended. A folded piece of paper, taped to the cabin's door, introduced itself not as a welcome note, but as a summons of sorts. Stamped with the insignia of the neighborhood's homeowners association, the letter declared that fishing in the lake was a violation of community guidelines. A fine had been issued, payable within 30 days. Confusion turned quickly to disbelief. The cabin owner had fished here for years, long before the association ever existed, long before the surrounding development sprawled up across the opposite bank, with its cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. Fishing was not a pastime for him. It was tradition, an inheritance of quiet rituals passed down from his grandfather who had first shown him where the base lingered near the reeds. Yet here it was, written in bold, cold words. Fishing prohibited, penalty enforced. The document carried an undertone of arrogance, as if those who had gathered themselves into a committee believed ownership of the water had shifted from nature itself to their printed bylaws. The lake was no longer portrayed as a shared resource or a natural treasure. It was a community feature, something to be regulated, managed, controlled, and anyone who resisted was subject to their brand of punishment. The fine itself was not ruinous in amount, but the principle burned hotter than the number on the page. How could people who had never so much as lifted an oar presume to regulate the one thing that gave the cabin its meaning? The HOA, a collective of neighbors whose reach was supposed to extend only to their own yards, had overstepped with confidence. What began as anger turned into determination. The cabin owner knew enough about the history of the property to sense that something about the HOA's claim rang hollow. His grandfather had once mentioned that the lake was privately deeded land, owned not by the houses that ringed it, but by a family who had long since moved away. Public access was limited, but private rights were clearly defined in dusty records that most people ignored. If those records could be found, perhaps they would tell a very different story than the one the HOA was trying to sell. The following days were spent not on the water, but in the county courthouse archives, sifting through file boxes that smelled faintly of mildew and old ink. There, beneath layers of property transfers and forgotten easements, the truth revealed itself. The HOA did not own the lake. The association's authority extended only to the parcels of land under its jurisdiction, and the lake was not one of them. The water and its shoreline remained the property of a trust, one that had lain dormant for decades. To the shock of the cabin owner, that trust was still active, and the rights could still be purchased, for a price. It was not a simple purchase, nor was it a small one. But to someone who valued principle over comfort, and who had spent years building enough savings to make his independence possible, the decision began to take shape. The HOA could issue fines, but those fines meant nothing without authority, and authority could be shattered with a single decisive action. On the same dock where the first line had once been cast as a child, the man made a promise to himself. He would not pay the fine. He would not surrender the peace that belonged to him. Instead, he would fight, not with noise or arguments, but with ownership itself. The lake had always been a sanctuary, But soon it would be more. Soon it would be his. And when that day came, the HOA would regret ever sliding a piece of paper under his door. The storm was forming, though none of the neighbors yet sensed it. The houses on the opposite bank glowed with porch lights and laughter. Lawns were trimmed, grills smoked, and sprinklers ticked under the summer sun. They believed their authority was untouchable, their rules unchallenged. But beneath the calm ripples of the lake, something was shifting. Something that would soon turn their comfortable world upside down. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork instead of fishing rods, signatures instead of casts, and negotiations instead of quiet mornings by the dock. At first, the process seemed overwhelming, like staring at a mountain too steep to climb. Lawyers had to be consulted, the trust that held the lake rights had to be contacted, and the finances had to be stretched in ways that made even the most confident saver nervous. Yet, with each step completed, the vision became clearer. The HOA would no longer dictate what could or could not be done on the lake. The trust that owned the lake had long been neglected. It was managed by distant descendants who no longer lived in the county, who barely remembered that their family still technically controlled the body of water. To them, the lake was not a source of joy or memory. It was a forgotten entry on a balance sheet. So, when approached with a legitimate offer to buy the entire property outright, they were more than happy to part with it. What they considered a burden, someone else saw as liberation. The cabin owner reviewed every clause with painstaking care. The purchase did not simply grant him rights to fish, it granted him ownership of the entire lake, from its outer edges where the reeds grew tall, to the deep basin in the center where the fish hid during the heat of summer. It gave him authority over boating, over swimming, over every ripple of water that touched the shoreline. The day the sale closed was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no fireworks, no sudden shift in the air. Just a folder full of documents, notarized and stamped, that declared a simple but profound truth. The lake no longer belonged to strangers or a trust. It belonged to him. Returning to the cabin, that evening, he stood at the dock and looked across the water. For the first time, he did not feel like a guest in his own sanctuary. He was not merely a user of the lake. He was its steward, its guardian, its sole owner. The fine that had been taped to his door just weeks earlier seemed almost laughable now, a flimsy attempt at control by a group that no longer had any jurisdiction over him. But the true power of ownership revealed itself only days later, when word of the sale began to trickle through the neighborhood. At first, the homeowners dismissed it as rumor. The idea that one man had purchased the entire lake seemed impossible, even absurd. But when official notices began arriving in their mailboxes, documents from the county clerk confirming the transfer of deed, the disbelief gave way to unease. The HOA board, accustomed to operating with unchecked authority, scrambled for explanations. They had always assumed the lake fell under their umbrella of control, that their rules extended naturally to its waters. Now, with undeniable proof that it belonged to someone else, their foundation cracked. They called emergency meetings, whispered on porches, and gossiped in cul-de-sacs, but the fact could not be undone. Ownership was a language they understood, and in that language, they had lost. The cabin owner, however, did not rush to flaunt his victory. He knew the shockwave would spread on its own. Instead, he returned to his routines, casting lines from the dock, sipping coffee by the shore, and watching as the neighborhood across the lake shifted from smug confidence to simmering frustration. He could see it in the way neighbors lingered, longer at mailboxes, in the way the HOA president paced her yard with a phone pressed tight to her ear. They were plotting, searching for some loophole, some technicality to claw back the control they believed was theirs by right. But the lake did not lie. The deed was unshakable. What began as quiet frustration soon turned to hostility. Cars slowed as they passed the cabin, their drivers glaring toward the dock. Children were pulled away from the shoreline, their parents muttering about changes and restrictions. Some neighbors still clung to denial, telling themselves that nothing would change, that they would continue to use the lake as before. But the tide was turning, and the cabin owner knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA made its next move. The true satisfaction came not from vengeance, but from freedom. No longer would there be notes taped to the door or fines slipped into mailboxes. No longer would he have to justify his presence on waters that had always been part of his life. The lake was his sanctuary once again. But now, it was also his statement. Still, there lingered the question of what to do with this newfound power. Ownership opened doors that could remain unlocked or slammed shut. Should the neighbors be allowed to continue using the lake as they always had, despite their association's arrogance? Or should the line be drawn firmly, as a reminder that overreach carried consequences? The cabin owner did not answer that question immediately. Instead, he allowed the weight of the decision to settle, as heavy as the still water at midnight. He had wrestled the lake from bureaucracy and entitlement, but how it would be used moving forward, that choice was his alone. As summer deepened, the HOA's anger grew louder. Rumors swirled of petitions, lawsuits, even attempts to rally homeowners into collective action. Yet all their noise crashed harmlessly against the wall of reality. The deed was clear, the ownership secure. For the first time in their existence, the HOA's power had limits. And it was only the beginning. Because the cabin owner, after weeks of reflection, knew exactly what he would do with his victory. The HOA had fined him for fishing. In response, he would do more than reclaim his right to cast a line. He would set new rules, rules that the association could not touch. And those rules would begin with a single decisive act, banning the neighborhood from the lake entirely. The water shimmered in the late afternoon sun, innocent and unaware of the storm about to break. The morning the notices went out was as calm as any other. The lake stretched under the soft haze of dawn. Birds skimmed the surface for insects, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. But beneath the stillness lay the tremor of change, one that would ripple through every home on the far shore. The cabin owner had spent days drafting the announcement, carefully wording each line so there would be no misunderstanding. Ownership granted him rights not just to fish, but to regulate all activity on the lake. And with those rights came authority, the kind that no neighborhood board or committee could override. The notices were brief, firm, and unmistakable. Effective immediately, all non-authorized access to the lake was prohibited. Swimming, boating, fishing, or any recreational use by members of the surrounding development was banned. The only person permitted to use the lake was its sole owner, and any trespassers would be treated as such. The envelopes arrived in the neighborhood's mailboxes that afternoon, each stamped with the same stark header: private property, no trespassing. What had once been quiet, grumbling ignited into outright uproar. Families who had grown accustomed to treating the lake as their own were suddenly confronted with the reality that they had never had that right. Children who played at the shoreline were pulled back with confusion, their parents fuming as they read and reread the notices. Boats that had bobbed lazily at the docks were dragged ashore, their owners muttering curses about selfishness and overreach. The HOA's board convened an emergency meeting in the president's living room, blinds drawn tight as if secrecy could somehow undo the words written on official letterhead. The president herself, a woman who had wielded power like a badge of honor, paced furiously. For years she had dictated the rules with confidence, enforcing fines and restrictions on everything from mailbox colors to lawn decorations. She had believed the lake was her crown jewel, the central piece of authority that made her position matter. Now, in one stroke, it was gone, replaced by a deed she could not challenge and a ban she could not overrule. The neighborhood seethed. Some called for lawsuits, convinced that no one man could strip them of what they had always assumed was theirs. Others plotted collective defiance, muttering about gathering at the shore and daring the owner to stop them. But beneath the anger was a creeping sense of helplessness. They had built their community around the illusion of control, and now that illusion was shattered. From the cabin, the owner watched quietly. He did not gloat or celebrate. Instead, he observed the unfolding chaos like a fisherman waiting for a bite, patient and calm. For too long, he had endured their arrogance, their assumption that his traditions could be fined away, that his peace could be disrupted with the stroke of a pen. Now the balance had shifted. And though the storm raged across the water, here on his dock there was only serenity. But the ban was not merely symbolic. Signs went up around the perimeter of the lake within days, bold and unmistakable. No trespassing. Private lake. Violators will be prosecuted. The cabin owner had them posted at every common access point the neighborhood once used. Near the boat ramp, along the walking path, even beside the benches where families gathered to feed ducks. Overnight, the shoreline transformed from an open playground into a forbidden frontier. The reaction was immediate. Parents tugged children away from the warning signs, shaking their heads in disbelief. Teenagers grumbled about losing their summer hangout, and the HOA president, infuriated beyond measure, began drafting letters of her own, peppered with legal jargon and threats of consequences. But threats carried no weight without power, and power was what she no longer had. As the days passed, tension in the neighborhood grew. Conversations at block parties and backyard barbecues circled endlessly around the same subject: the lake. What had once been a source of pride now felt like a wound, visible from every backyard that faced the water. They could see it, but they could not touch it. They could watch the cabin owner fish from his dock, but they could not drop a line themselves. Each ripple on the surface mocked them, a reminder of their loss. The HOA president refused to accept defeat. She began contacting lawyers, scouring property laws for loopholes, insisting there must be some clause that could undo the deed or restore access. She filed complaints with the county, called in favors from officials, even floated rumors of a class action lawsuit. But every path ended the same way. The deed was ironclad. The lake was private. The owner's authority was absolute, and with each failure, her frustration grew darker. The cabin owner, meanwhile, carried on with quiet confidence. He cast his lines at sunrise, pulled in fish at dusk, and sat on his dock sipping coffee while the neighborhood across the water churned with resentment. He had not sought this battle, but now that it had come, he embraced the clarity it brought. The HOA had fined him for fishing, attempting to control what was never theirs to control. In return, he had reclaimed the lake entirely, stripping them of every privilege they had taken for granted. The standoff reached a breaking point, one late afternoon when a group of teenagers, emboldened by the growing resentment in the neighborhood, decided to test the ban. They dragged an old canoe down the path, slipped it into the water, and paddled toward the center of the lake, laughing and shouting as if daring the owner to stop them. Word spread quickly, and soon parents gathered at the shoreline, some watching, nervously, others cheering the defiance. The HOA president stood at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, a smug smile hinting that the tide was turning back in her favor. But the cabin owner was ready. He did not storm down to the dock in anger or shout across the water. Instead, he picked up his phone and made a call. A calm, measured act that carried more weight than any confrontation. Within 20 minutes, a sheriff's deputy arrived, lights flashing, and the canoe was escorted back to shore. The teenagers received stern warnings, their parents fumed, and the HOA president's smug smile crumbled under the authority of the law. The message was clear. The ban was real, and it would be enforced. The neighborhood's fury boiled over that night. Voices were raised in living rooms, accusations flew across fences, and the HOA president vowed that this was not the end. She swore that no single man could hold an entire community hostage, that somehow, some way, she would restore what had been lost. But in the cabin across the lake, the owner sat quietly, the reflection of moonlight rippling across the water. He knew their anger would not fade quickly. He knew the HOA president would stop at nothing to reclaim her authority. What she did not know was that he had only just begun to exercise the power he now held. And soon, her attempts to fight back would drag the entire neighborhood into a war they could not win. The lake no longer shimmered as a symbol of shared pride. It had become a battlefield, though the weapons were not swords or rifles, but letters, meetings, and calculated attempts at intimidation. The HOA president, stripped of her most treasured authority, refused to accept the humiliation quietly. If she could not control the lake through rules, she would try to win it back through force of will, legal maneuvering, and sheer persistence. Her campaign began with propaganda. Within a week of the ban, homeowners found glossy newsletters in their mailboxes, each stamped with the association's seal. The message was clear. The cabin owner was portrayed as a selfish opportunist, someone who had deliberately stolen the lake from the community for his own amusement. The narrative painted the HOA as victims of a greedy outsider, a manipulator who had twisted legal technicalities to rob families of their rightful enjoyment. Words like injustice and community theft dripped from every paragraph, crafted to stoke anger and unify the residents under her banner. And unify they did, at least on the surface. Neighbors who had once barely nodded at each other now gathered in clusters, shaking their heads and fuming about how unfair it was. Children repeated their parents' bitterness, pointing toward the cabin as though it were an enemy fortress. Even those who quietly acknowledged that the HOA had overstepped before were reluctant to speak against the tide of outrage. Few dared to question the president's narrative, lest they become outcasts themselves. But the cabin owner was unmoved. He had expected this. Ownership had stripped the HOA of its power, but pride would not let the president admit defeat. She would fight with words, with appearances, with anything that allowed her to cling to relevance. Yet propaganda could not alter deeds filed at the courthouse, nor could it erase posted signs that warned trespassers away. When her campaign of persuasion failed to force a retreat, the president escalated again, this time through harassment. She filed constant complaints with the county, alleging environmental violations, water contamination, even unlawful structures along the shoreline. Inspectors arrived in trucks, clipboards in hand, walking the perimeter of the cabin as if searching for ghosts. Each time they left empty-handed, their reports noting no violations, no breaches of law. But the constant stream of visits was not meant to uncover truth. It was meant to wear down patience. Neighbors joined in the pressure, staging gatherings near the property line, their conversations loud enough to carry across the water. Laughter was forced, tones exaggerated, all designed to send the same message: you are not welcome here. Trash began to appear near the path leading to the cabin. Empty soda cans, fast food bags, things carelessly tossed where they had never been before. Some nights, headlights lingered too long at the edge of the driveway, engines idling before slipping away into the dark. The harassment was petty, but it was constant. And beneath it all was the driving hand of the HOA president, orchestrating every tactic like a general marshalling her troops. Yet the harder she pushed, the stronger the owner's resolve became. He documented every incident, collected every inspection report that cleared him, and filed his own complaints when trespassing could be proven. Slowly, methodically, he built a record, not of his wrongdoing, but of theirs. The tipping point came when the president attempted her boldest move yet. She announced a community reclamation day, an event where homeowners were encouraged to gather at the lakefront park and take to the water in open defiance of the ban. Flyers advertised it as a celebration of unity, complete with food trucks, music, and the promise of restoring our rights. It was no longer just a protest, it was a spectacle. The day arrived with clear skies and warm air, perfect weather for confrontation. Families streamed toward the shoreline, children in swimsuits, kayaks and paddleboards in tow. The HOA president stood at the center like a queen surveying her court, her confidence restored by the sheer number of people who had answered her call. To her, this was the moment of triumph, proof that one man could not stand against the will of an entire community, but she had underestimated her opponent. The cabin owner had anticipated this event from the moment whispers of it reached his ears. He had contacted the sheriff's department in advance, provided copies of his deed, and requested their presence should trespassing occur. So when the first kayaks hit the water, sirens echoed down the road. Deputies stepped out, their arrival as calm and deliberate as the lake itself. Notices were handed out, warnings delivered. Homeowners were informed that they were trespassing on private property, and refusal to comply could result in arrest. The festive atmosphere deflated instantly. Music stopped, children were pulled back, and neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered under their breath about abuse of power, but none dared to push past the deputies' warnings. One by one, the boats were dragged back onto the grass, the laughter silenced, the defiance drained away. The HOA president's face burned with fury, her grand spectacle reduced to an embarrassing failure. What she had envisioned as a show of strength had become a public demonstration of weakness. The community had seen it with their own eyes. The law was not on her side. No amount of newsletters or rallies could change that. The fallout was swift. Whispered frustrations turned not toward the cabin owner, but toward the president herself. Homeowners who had once cheered her now questioned her judgment, asking why she had led them into a battle they could never win. Some grew quiet, retreating from the conflict entirely. Others began to wonder if the association's endless fights were worth the stress and division. The unity she had fought so hard to build cracked under the weight of her failure. But the president did not retreat. If anything, the embarrassment only hardened her resolve. In her mind, the cabin owner had humiliated her, and humiliation was unforgivable. She would not stop. She would not rest. If she could not defeat him through the community, then she would find another way. Through legal challenges, through personal vendettas, through any means available. The lake lay calm that evening, as though nothing had happened. Fish darted beneath the surface. The wind stirred ripples against the dock, and the cabin owner sat quietly, the reflection of the fading sun painting the water gold. To him, the day had proven a simple truth. Possession was not just 9/10 of the law. In this case, it was everything. But he also knew something else. The HOA president had not yet accepted defeat. She would push harder, dig deeper, and lash out more recklessly. And in doing so, she would seal her own downfall. Because battles fought in desperation rarely end in victory. They end in collapse. The neighborhood had always operated under an illusion that the HOA's authority was absolute, unquestionable, and permanent. For years, the president had wielded that authority with precision, bending homeowners to her will through a mixture of fines, threats, and relentless oversight. But the lake changed everything. What had once been her greatest symbol of power had become the very thing that exposed her weakness. The failed Community Reclamation Day lingered in the minds of the residents far longer than she expected. At first, the embarrassment was dismissed as a temporary setback, something to be brushed off with bold words and renewed promises. But as days turned to weeks, the quiet discontent in the neighborhood grew louder. People whispered in driveways, exchanged knowing glances at block gatherings, and began to openly question her leadership. For the first time, cracks spread through the facade of unity she had so carefully crafted. Determined to reassert control, the president turned to more desperate measures. She filed lawsuit after lawsuit, attempting to challenge the deed on technical grounds. She argued that the lake's historical use as a community resource constituted an implied easement, that the ownership transfer was fraudulent, that environmental protections prohibited privatization. Each claim was struck down in court, the rulings clear and decisive. The deed was valid, the ownership unshakable. With every loss, her credibility eroded further. Homeowners who had once stood firmly behind her grew wary of the legal fees piling up, many of which were being siphoned from HOA funds without their knowledge. When the treasurer quietly disclosed just how much money had been drained into these losing battles, anger spread like wildfire. Dues had risen, services had been cut back, all so the president could wage her personal war against one man on the opposite shore. The unraveling accelerated when county investigators, tipped off by complaints about mismanagement, began auditing the HOA's finances. What they uncovered was worse than misused funds. Years of sloppy bookkeeping, questionable expenditures, and even hints of self-dealing came to light. Landscaping contracts awarded to companies run by relatives, inflated invoices for maintenance, petty reimbursements that seemed more like personal indulgences than community expenses. The residents were stunned. They had trusted her for years, believing her to be a strict but necessary leader. Now, the image of order and authority crumbled into one of greed and self-interest. The woman who had accused the cabin owner of selfishness was exposed as the most selfish of them all. But the president refused to back down. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that the audits were politically motivated, that the cabin owner was behind the investigations, that the entire system was conspiring to strip her of her rightful role. Her rants grew longer, her tone sharper, her grip on reality more fragile. Meetings devolved into shouting matches, with homeowners walking out in disgust while she clung to her podium, shouting into empty rooms. The more she fought, the more isolated she became. Friends who had once defended her stopped answering her calls. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even members of her own board began resigning quietly, unwilling to sink with the ship. Meanwhile, the cabin owner remained silent. He did not attend their meetings, did not respond to their letters, did not engage in their gossip. He simply fished, tended to his cabin, and allowed the natural course of events to unfold. To the neighborhood, his silence was infuriating. To him, it was victory. The final blow came not from a courtroom or a county investigator, but from within her own community. At a hastily called special meeting, fueled by months of frustration and betrayal, the homeowners voted to remove her as president. The motion passed with overwhelming support, her voice drowned beneath a chorus of anger and resentment. For the first time in her reign, her gavel fell silent. She left the meeting red-faced and trembling, muttering threats of return, but her power was gone. The HOA board, fractured and weary, dissolved soon after. Without her leadership, and with the weight of debt and scandal pressing down, the association collapsed under its own weight. The neighborhood entered a strange limbo. Some residents celebrated the end of the HOA, relieved to be free from its endless rules and fines. Others mourned the loss of what they believed had once held their community together. But all of them shared one undeniable reality. The lake was gone. Not physically, of course. The water still shimmered in the sun, the fish still darted beneath the reeds, but their access to it had vanished forever. The irony was bitter. They had tried to punish a man for fishing. In return, he had stripped them of not just their lake, but the very system they had trusted to protect it. As summer gave way to autumn, the HOA president's presence dwindled. Rumors spread of her, moving away, of selling her home to escape the humiliation that clung to her like a shadow. Her name became a cautionary tale, spoken in hushed tones whenever neighbors discussed power, pride, and downfall. And across the lake, the cabin owner stood once again on his dock, the crisp air cool against his skin, the water calm and silent. He had not sought revenge, but revenge had found its way regardless. He had not plotted her destruction, yet her obsession with him had led her to destroy herself. The lake was his sanctuary once more, but it was also something larger now. It was proof that arrogance could be defeated, that bullies could fall, that peace could outlast noise. But as he watched the autumn leaves drift across the water, he knew the story was not finished. The HOA was gone, its president disgraced, but the neighborhood would never forget what had happened. Some still harbored resentment, still looked across the water with envy and bitterness. The battle was won, but the ripples would carry on for years. The lake would remember. And so would they. Winter settled over the lake like a heavy quilt, muffling the noise that had once rolled across its waters. The neighborhood on the far shore grew quieter, its lights dimmer, its spirits subdued. Gone were the days of endless meetings, threats, and newsletters. Gone, too, was the relentless presence of the HOA president, whose voice had once echoed through every cul-de-sac. What remained was stillness, both in the air and in the lives of those who had been caught in her spiral. The collapse of the association left behind more than silence. It left scars. The homeowners who had once been unified under the rules and restrictions of the HOA now found themselves untethered. For some, it was liberation. Mailboxes could finally be painted whatever color they wished. Holiday decorations could stretch across lawns without fear of fines. For others, it was chaos. Disputes between neighbors, once mediated through committees, now simmered unresolved. Without the central authority of the HOA, the neighborhood revealed its true nature. Not a community of order, but a cluster of households bound only by proximity. And always, looming over them, was the lake. Its surface froze in patches as winter deepened, reflecting the bare skeletons of trees and the pale wash of moonlight. For the homeowners, it was no longer a place of joy or pride. It was a reminder of loss, of humiliation, of battles fought and failed. Parents avoided mentioning it to their children, who still remembered the summers when the water had been theirs. Even those who had once cheered the president's defiance now kept their distance, unwilling to relive the sting of defeat. But for the cabin owner, the lake remained what it had always been: peace. He rose before dawn to watch the mist curl from its surface, chopped wood to feed the fire in his cabin stove, and waited for the ice to clear so he could cast his lines again. The lake did not ask for authority or control. It asked only for respect, for quiet, for presence. And in return, it offered the solace that had first drawn him here so many years ago: From time to time he reflected on the storm that had passed. He thought about the letter taped to his door, the arrogance of a fine for fishing, the chain of events it had set in motion. He thought about the president, so sure of her power, undone by her own obsession. He thought about the neighbors, some angry still, some resigned, some who had even reached out privately with apologies once the dust had settled. He did not hate them. In truth, he pitied them. They had been led astray by pride, by the illusion of control, by the belief that rules could replace respect. They had lost not because he had taken something from them, but because they had never truly owned what they claimed. The lake had always been independent, always been separate. All he had done was remind them of that truth. Over time, the story of the lake spread beyond the neighborhood. People in nearby towns whispered about it, shaking their heads at the absurdity of an HOA trying to fine a man for fishing, marveling at the twist that he had turned the tables by buying the lake itself. The tale grew into a kind of legend, retold at barbecues, in diners, at campgrounds by other lakes. Each retelling added its own embellishments, but the core remained the same. A man had stood against an HOA, and he had won. The cabin owner never sought fame, but it found him nonetheless. Letters arrived occasionally from strangers thanking him for standing up to what they called neighborhood tyrants. Some asked for advice on their own HOA battles. Others simply wanted reassurance that it was possible to push back and win. He answered few, but he read them all, smiling at the thought that his quiet act of defiance had given others courage. The lake itself, though, remained unchanged. Seasons turned, ice melted, fish returned to the reeds. The dock creaked under, his boots as it always had. The water rippled beneath the oars of his small boat. The loons called at dusk, their cries echoing across the shoreline. The world beyond might have transformed, but here, at the water's edge, time still held its steady rhythm. And in that rhythm lay the final truth. Victory was not loud. It did not come with headlines or applause. It came with quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, with the knowledge that he had defended what mattered, that he had preserved what was his, that he had refused to be bullied into submission. The HOA was gone, its president disgraced, its rules dissolved. The neighborhood had changed, forever marked by the battle it had lost. But the lake remained, steadfast and eternal, its ownership clear, its purpose unaltered. As spring returned and the first fish tugged at his line, the cabin owner smiled. What had begun as a petty fine had ended as something far greater. A reminder that peace could be defended, that arrogance could be humbled, and that sometimes the quietest victories echoed the longest. The sun broke over the water, golden light, dancing across the ripples. The lake belonged to him now. But more than that, it belonged to no one else. And that was enough.